All right, good afternoon and welcome to the 7th webinar in our monthly Forensic Educational Equity series. I am Amy Dickerson.
I'm Kendra Yoch.
And Kendra and I continue to be your moderators for this monthly series that is running throughout the year. During this series, we are exploring how school districts can identify and break down systemic barriers that are depriving our Black and Brown students of equitable educational opportunities. We're exploring how to more intentionally allocate resources based on need and how to use the law as a driver for internal reforms to support our most vulnerable student populations. These conversations may not always be comfortable, but they are critical to helping make meaningful and positive changes in our public school systems. Today, we will be discussing student discipline, specifically racial disparities and disproportionality in exclusionary discipline, relationships with SROs, and improving school climate. Recent data from the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights reveals continued disproportionality in school discipline responses, particularly when comparing Black and white students and in relation to students with disabilities. So in today's webinar, we will discuss steps school districts can take to comply with legal requirements, avoid liability, and combat disproportionality, including through the use of restorative disciplinary practices, staff training, and culturally responsive instruction. We are thrilled to have with us today Dr. Jerry Anderson, principal at Bloom High School in Bloom Township High School District 206, and Dr. Ellen Swanson, assistant superintendent for student services in Des Plaines School District 62. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today. Our colleague Emily Tulloch has also joined us for today's discussion. So to everyone listening, we are so happy that you are here today as well. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. It is much easier for us to keep track of and answer questions there than in the chat. So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact any of us as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Great. Okay, so let's start with some background. Jerry and Ellen, can you tell us just a little bit about your schools and districts and give us a little bit of background information to get us started? Ellen, you want to start?
Sure. So District 62, located in Des Plaines, Illinois. We're an elementary school district, but serve pre-K to 8th grade students. We have about 4,400 students with 8 elementary buildings, 2 middle schools, 1 year-round school, and 1 early learning center. A little bit about our demographics. We are about 39% white, 42% Hispanic, 12% Asian, 4% Black, and 3.2% or more in terms of multiple races. 44.5% low income and 33% EL students.
Great, and Dr. Anderson?
Yes, I am at Bloom Township School District 206, South Suburbs of Chicago. There are 3 high schools, 2 general high schools and an alternative school, high school. Our student population is about 40% African American, about 45% Latino. So those are the biggest portions of our school population. And we have a large percentage of students who are on free reduced lunch and a large percentage of students who speak English as a second language.
Great. Well, we're really happy to not only have each of you here today in your own rights, but also to hear your perspectives and approaches coming from an elementary and middle school setting, Dr. Swanson, as well as from the high school setting, Dr. Anderson. So if each of you could give us a sort of a high-level overview of your district's approach to student behavior and student discipline. And Ellen, we can start with you.
Sure, I'm going to take us back a little bit. So I joined District 62 in 2013, and when I joined the district, I would say the approach to student behavior was always really about wanting to ensure that students were learning and learning what it is that when they engaged in a behavior, learning what they did wrong and how to do things differently the next time. But what I would say is we needed more of a systemic approach to how we address that. So one of the things that when I joined the district, I really focused quite a bit on was that restorative approach, and how to be systemic in having our staff, but also our students and our families understand that when engaging in behavior that required discipline, we wanted to make sure that everyone understood that our intent was for kids to learn and students to learn how to do things differently. And so that required training, professional learning, really sometimes, at times, difficult conversations with staff who may have been a little bit more used to that punitive and consequential punishment. But we really took some time to explain what restorative practices were and why they were important under the umbrella of social emotional learning. The other thing I would say, and this was supported by our leadership, our Superintendent Hurdle, who is on our call right now too, listening, it really had to come from leadership in the Board of Education, really understanding and promoting the importance of modeling, learning, but also restoring relationships when they were damaged. And so with Senate Bill 100 that came out in 2016, that really supported our approach to doing things more systemically.
That's great. Jerry?
So I'm a principal who's new at one school, transitioning from another school. So I'm gonna give you a little bit about where I've been and also where I am. So I arrived in Illinois about 4 years ago to a high school, and SB 100 had just come out the previous year. And we were really just starting that journey of restorative practices. In fact, I got the letter about being disproportionate and what are you guys going to do about this? You know, we have a task, we got to change this picture. And really started with beginning to have conversations about restorative practices with key leaders. Talking about our deans, our counselors, our administrators, because it's really important that your leadership understand the direction you're going and what you're going to do before you go down that path. So we actually brought in an organization in Moja to do some training for us on restorative practices. It's like 32 hours of training, not just one day, really getting deep into what restorative practices look like and how could they look in a school. We really moved from there, going through that training, to really starting to bring our teachers in and really starting with norms and having norms in classrooms and understandings about behavior, because so many times people decide that they're going to not include. When kids get in high school, I think having agreements sometimes it's really much more effective than coming to the class and saying, this is what we will do, because they become a community. And that's also a very culturally responsive, kind of practice, is building a community and having those members of the community have a say-so about their agreements and what it's going to take for them to have a classroom where they can learn. It was a little bit challenging because people are used to being punitive, and it's kind of hard to move away from that because it's what has happened, what people have experienced. So the norms were kind of a neutral way. It's something that people could really buy into in getting started and understanding. And I will tell you, they really came in handy during the pandemic when there was no hands-on, no punitive was going to work, having agreements about how we're going to work together. What I'm really, where I am now, they really also are going down that journey and really aligning what we're doing with regards to equity, restorative practices, and SEL, looking at student social emotional learning. So we're beginning that journey again with the new staff and getting things aligned and really talking about how do we begin to shift. And how do we begin here in this environment too, to begin to bring people on board for wanting to proactively create a restorative environment? People think about restorative as in response to, but it really, there's a lot of work you do in advance that has to do with creating this positive environment that's built on having these foundational positive relationships. So really making that known and understanding the principles and understanding it's just not a flavor of the day. It's something that's going to be throughout our organization and something that's going to be about all of our practices, not just something that we do occasionally when there's a conflict.
Thanks. That was really good to hear. You know, it sounds like there's an ongoing shift in transformation in all three of these districts here as we move from the kind of traditional to more restorative practices related to student discipline. And you guys touched on a couple buzzwords that I think we hear a lot: restorative practices, social emotional learning, trauma responsive practices, culturally responsive approaches. Can you guys tell me a little bit more about how those concepts fit together, and how do you use you know, any combination of them within your districts?
Certainly. So that's a great question. And one thing that I talk about with staff and I try to explain so it's not as confusing, is that oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, and kind of the way I look at it is that social emotional learning is the plate. And all of these other things are part of the plate and make up social emotional learning. They're just different ways to achieve ensuring that students are supported in all of the ways that, if you look at the CASEL website and look at all of the essential social emotional skills, that students are taught those things. So restorative practices is one way to get at, and let me give you an example. So if one of the restorative practices is to, when two students engage in conflict, is to sit down and have a restorative circle. What is that teaching within the SEL umbrella, or under the SEL umbrella? And that's that relationship building, conflict resolution. You're building those skills through the use of a restorative approach. And so similarly with trauma responsive practices, so much of what we just experienced in the last year, what our students and our families, including our staff, have gone through as it relates to the pandemic, there are so many ways that you can consider what we've just experienced, trauma and traumatic in nature. And so many of the ways that we have to talk with one another and resolve some of the conflict that families are having and experiencing that they've never experienced before, or students who have been isolated and haven't had the ability to form relationships in the way that they may have in person. I've recognized even at recess, students who are in masks and are playing together socially, again, under that social emotional umbrella, that social interaction, those social skills are different right now, just in terms of what we're seeing in younger children in terms of interactions. And so I like to say that, like I said, SEL is sort of the plate. All of those other things, Kendra, that you just referred to in the question, they're ways to achieve social emotional learning skills.
I think what I would just add is that, let's talk about the plate. We could give that plate a name. That plate could be equity. If you think about it, if you're doing all of these things, you're really creating a more equitable environment where you are attending to the needs of individual students with whatever it is that they have to bring. And you're creating a community in which all of those students can experience success and feel a sense of belonging.
That's great. Thank you guys for helping kind of frame that for us. These are really big shifts, as you guys mentioned, for a lot of educators, administrators, and for families even. So it's important work as we try to build these practices and approaches. Can you talk to us a little bit about the training you've done for your staff and your administration to help them understand and implement this, and not feel like, ooh, you just took away everything that was in my old toolbox and now I don't know what to do? Jerry, you want to start on that one?
Absolutely. Well, there's a variety of different trainings. We'll start with one thing is being able to look at data and to really understand what data is telling you about what's happening in your building. Looking at data with regard to gender, race, special education, free, all free and reduced, all the ways that you can break down data, really looking at data and seeing what your discipline data looks like, and seeing where there are areas. We're using a system here, it's called Swiss, here in this district, where infractions are broke down by what's the infraction, where did it take place, what time of day, who wrote it, all of that. So you can have this really deep look. And then it's really about how do you respond? How do you respond to behavior also? So we've done a few things. On the front hand, we've looked at how do we build community and have the norms and write norms and get that established in our classrooms so students have something to restore. And then on the back end, what do we do when we run into circumstances where students are not holding up the agreements that were initially put in place? And really having specific training on how to have those conversations. Talk about being able to have restorative conversations, to have community building circles, to have restorative circles, really how you create an environment where everyone's voice is included and heard, and you allow people to hear each other and hear the different sides and come to resolution. If you think about how so many times in the past, there was a response to a disagreement between students, or we'll just get them both out of the environment, and when they come back, they're going to get along. Well, we know that that's not true. We know that when there's conflict and conflict is not resolved, it's going to continue. So really being able to get to what that conflict is and being able to get to the crux of that. And so those are two types of training, and I'm sure that Ellen can talk a little bit about the trauma, because we've done some of that too, the trauma-informed practices, but I'll let her go ahead and talk a little bit about that.
So one thing that was an approach that we took in District 62, when you look at 12 buildings, early childhood to middle school, and we're trying to shift our practices and help administrators first, but also then teachers and our staff to understand why we are shifting our practices. They have to be comfortable in what the practices are that we're expecting. So one of the ways, and this was sort of I didn't know if this would work or not, but several years ago, we did engage a consultant who came in, and the way we structured her time with on-site training for principals. First, she would meet with principals, and then she would go into classrooms, and we would expect circles to be taking place and restorative practices to be taking place. We would model those practices for principals. We'd support principals with doing circles and having restorative conversations during staff meetings, but then we'd also trickle down into classrooms so that we'd have somebody providing feedback, supporting. If a teacher wasn't comfortable doing a morning meeting because they'd never done it before, we'd have someone do it for them. And over time, it really became part of the fabric, part of the culture of that's just how we're going to run meetings. My superintendent sometimes, and I joke about, hey, let's do an administrative council meeting and do a circle. Well, if we don't model it for our administrators and we don't take time to listen to what others have to say and do, serious questions, but also get to know each other, relationship questions, it really doesn't then become part of who we are, which is then part of what we expect our staff and our children to do. So that was one, I would say, way that we engaged in training that was a success, and we continue to practice that today. But engaging a consultant who really was comfortable, and then having a really strict schedule on where that consultant was going, what days of the week, what times we're going to be supporting those different buildings was critical.
That's great and really helpful insights to hear how you've implemented those at your districts. You know, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, data, you know, and I mentioned earlier that the Office for Civil Rights recently released data from their civil rights data collection, referred to often as the CRDC, that highlighted continuing racial disparities in student discipline. And specifically, the data demonstrated that students of color are subjected to disproportionate disciplinary action when compared to white peers. And specifically, the data revealed that in 2017-2018, Black students represented only 15% of the total student enrollment, but accounted for 29% of referrals to law enforcement, where in contrast, white students accounted for 47% of total student enrollment, but only 38% of referrals to law enforcement. Black students also received disproportionately more exclusionary discipline consequences than their white counterparts. So Ellen and Jerry, can you talk a little bit more about what extent your districts are looking at your own data, or that you would anticipate, you know, them doing so related to student discipline, and how this, you know, informs your actions, or you anticipate it to inform your actions? Jerry, do we want to start with you?
So when we talk about looking at something, using a system like the Swiss system, where you know where something happens, for example, where the majority of your incidents take place. What is it about that environment? What can you do? How can you be proactive in making sure that that's not an unsupervised area? Another thing is really looking at like the time of day when things are taking place, because sometimes it does have to do with things that are going on in the culture that you might not be aware of, and you need to be attentive to that. And then the types of infractions. You know, I think it's really important because some infractions are very subjective, and some infractions are not. Like, what does it mean to be disruptive? What does it mean to be disrespectful? You know, really looking at what you're talking about when you are having those types of infractions, and really going all the way down to the referral. Well, what was said? Why was this disruptive? Why was this considered to be this? Because sometimes I think what you have is situations where there's not always enough cultural understanding of how people express themselves, right? And knowing that individuals don't always express themselves the same, and that's okay. And also knowing to be able to set, I think it's okay to have norms for your classroom and have expectations for your classroom. But it's also important to take into consideration who's in the classroom and why are they having those conversations, and what's the antecedent, what causes the behavior to take place, and knowing how to respond in a way that de-escalates as opposed to escalate. So it really even feeds the professional development that you get, and it feeds your data, also feeds what behaviors you really target and what behaviors you really want to examine. I think there was an author, they talked about behaviors that you want to bring to extinction. You know, those things that are really those prominent things that are taking up the most time in your community, being those things that you would like to see change. Well, getting student voice, you know, and talking about, you know, why things look the way they do, understanding the staff perspective, and then having really concrete strategies that you can use. So data is really the window to doing so many other things that we can do.
I agree with so much of what Jerry just said. And in terms of data in District 62, we have looked very closely at our racial disparities in terms of student discipline. As I said, I joined the district in 2013. And when I joined the district, there were over 100 out of school suspensions annually. That was pretty typical. So between 2013 and I will say to 1920, 2021, we had none, but then again, we were often remote, or we only had a percentage of our students in person. So this year was a little unique, but let me go back to 1920 through March when we all ended up at home through the pandemic. We went from over 100 out of school suspensions to 7. That's a 94% reduction. And let me talk you through sort of how that occurred as we looked at data. every single suspension or consideration for suspension in our district went through me. So the questions that I asked were, I asked specifically, what race is the student? What have we done before to help support the student? What are we teaching? And again, let me make a distinction too between high school and elementary. Behaviors in an elementary school district, I formerly worked in a high school district as well, they look very different. So oftentimes we were suspending for things like fighting that was easily broken up, or swearing that turned into slightly more aggressive communication, oftentimes use of marijuana or alcohol being brought to school. And so one of the things that we took an approach to with administrators was, how do we address those things, those types of behaviors, so that instead of sending students home, where oftentimes they're unsupervised, or they're just not, they're missing out on any type of learning or any type of way to sort of repair the damage that was done, keeping them in school. We have rooms where we have individuals who are in spaces where they're supporting student behavior. So they're repairing relationships for a couple of days. It's still learning, still accessing instruction, but there's another part of their instructional day that sometimes students would then be doing for those days instead of being home. So one of the things that we really took a pretty direct approach in our district in doing this was, hey, listen, every single potential suspension, along with the fact that in 2016, when we had to do 1 to 3 and 4 to 5 day suspensions and all the paperwork requirements, that was not fun for anybody. And so I think there was sort of a mutually agreed upon, like, if we don't have to suspend, but we can teach and model and repair and restore whatever damage was done in a different way, as long as there's not an immediate threat to safety in that building. And that was always the criteria. Is there an immediate threat coming back in, walking back in tomorrow? And 99% of the time there wasn't. So we would just get creative with how we would kind of have to shift our thinking a little bit, even if that's not what we were used to figure out how to support that student, that family, get the parents or guardians engaged, so that we could repair the damage that was done.
On the backside, Ellen, I really like what you said in talking about, like, distinguishing between the grade levels. I think that something you said is key too, though. It's really socially, emotionally where that child is, and even with teenagers, that whole idea of relationship building and being able to have a student be able to talk about how they're feeling, what happened to them, what's going on with their day, having the social workers, having that kind of support for students is really important, because sometimes some of the behavior that you might see has to do with something else that the child is experiencing. The student's experiencing something that causes them to act out in a certain way. And I think one of the things that brought that home to me one day was a young lady who was about to be suspended for disruptive behavior. She was being really disruptive. She came into my office and she sat down and she goes, "I want to tell you what's going on with me." She said, "Your staff cares a whole lot about my test. They care a whole lot about me being in class. But did anybody even bother to ask why I'm so upset? Do they even know that my brother died last week? Did anybody even ask me? No, they just assume I'm doing this because I want to act out. Well, I'm upset." And you go, whoa, you kind of slow down for a second and you say, well, who had the relationship? Who had the conversation? Who did this kid go to? Is sending her home right now the thing that we really need to be doing? Is there another way that we should be handling this situation, now that we're at this point in time? But that's why that whole, you hear SEL come up so much, is because kids, well, students are people too. They have emotions and feelings, and they need to be attended to just like adults want their emotions and feelings attended to. it's so key, it's so important to know where they're coming from and what they're experiencing, and knowing and having resources and people to support them where they are.
You know what Jerry just said, I want to make clear something. Jerry and I, we just met the other day, and one thing that is clear that I want those listening to understand is this does not mean that we condone or we say that whatever students are engaging in is not appropriate or is not right, or that they shouldn't have some sort of you can use the word punishment or consequence or some sort of response. We do have to respond, but I think what the sort of frame of mind that we come from is it's really truly taking the time to understand the purpose behind the behavior, and that takes time. That's far. It's interesting. It actually takes far more time to get to the crux of the issue and to have circles and to have restorative chats and to sit down and get staff together and students together and parents together than it is to just say, you're gone, see you in 3 days. I mean, it's far less work for us to send kids home. So I think that's the piece that I want those listening to understand is this is really about holding kids accountable in a different way. And one of the things I've learned, and I engaged in a restorative conversation a few weeks before school ended, and it involved about 50, it was a pretty big incident, and it involved about 15 individuals. And these kids were 4th graders, 5th graders, and it was hard for them to sit in a circle and talk with their parents there and apologize and own the piece that they had in a pretty serious situation. But at the same time, I was watching like their wheels turn and understanding that, oh, wow, what I did had an impact on this human being, and I hurt this person, and what might I do differently next time? And having kids talk through that in a very formal way is really impactful. And I think when you think about it from an administrative perspective, it is easier for us to send kids away. But it is far more meaningful, at least in my experience, to have students and families and staff come together and try to repair whatever damage was done.
Thank you both. So many good insights there. And I mean, we started this question with data, and I like, Jerry, how you talked about it as a window, right? We're not collecting data just to say we had X number and we were able to reduce it, or we told our principals no more than this number of suspensions, right? That's not what it's about. It's a window to see what's happening, and are the practices that we're doing helping? Are we making a difference? And I like the way you both kind of brought this back to the relationship piece, as well as it's not a get out of jail free card that we're going to do restorative practices. We're going to do this in a more teaching and learning type of way, which I think is really important. I do want to bring Emily in here and talking about data. Emily, tell us a little bit about what are the requirements for gathering and reporting data related to student discipline?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of great conversation about how we can use data to really inform discipline practices and policies and how to move forward. But there's also some legal requirements for gathering and reporting on discipline data. So districts are required to provide ISB with data on the total number of suspensions, expulsions, and removals to the alternative setting each school year. ISB then analyzes all of that data collected over a 3-year span of time to identify districts that are in the top 20% for suspensions, expulsions, and removals to the alternative setting. So meaning those that have the highest number in those categories. And then ISB's report also disaggregates the discipline data by race and ethnicity, gender, age, grade level, and a couple other factors as well. If a district is identified as being a district that's in that top 20% through ISB's report, they're then required to develop a plan that identifies strategies the school district can use to implement or strategies the district can implement to reduce the use of exclusionary discipline practices or reduce any racial disparities, or both. And then once a school district creates that plan, it has to be submitted to ISB, and the district then has to collect more data, track the implementation of its plan, any results that are achieved, and continue that report process.
Thanks, and I'll kind of tie that back to our equity webinar last month on special education and some of the reporting requirements there. You know, we've got some similarities on the data that's being reported and the types of patterns that we need to be on the lookout for that can then really be the catalyst of putting in place those programs or strengthening them to address problems that are identified. I did notice in the chat, we had a comment that students with disabilities need to be really included in this discussion as well, because they are frequently disciplined based on behaviors that may be part of a deficit that's related to the disability. And I can't remember who was talking about really getting at the crux of why is the student acting out, and it's almost like doing kind of a mini FBA on like any student, right? Like we're trying to figure out what is the antecedent, what are the underlying causes to figure out the right way to respond, because it could be different if it's because of a tragedy at home or a skill deficit or any of the other different things that might cause a student to act out. And Emily, let me come back to you a little bit here. In addition to collecting this data and kind of creating these rules, do we have any guidance either from ISB or from the federal government about, you know, what can schools do? What are the resources out there to help in these areas?
Yeah, so I'll start out at the federal level. We have not seen very much guidance in the area of student discipline over the last several years. You may all remember the discipline guidance that was put into place under President Obama that suggested schools could be in violation of federal civil rights laws if students of color were disciplined at higher rates than their white peers. This guidance was rescinded back in 2018 by the Trump administration, and nothing formal has really been issued since. I am going to dive a little bit into the Obama era guidance just because I think that we might be seeing some similar, some similar viewpoints coming out of the Biden administration. So that Obama era guidance really stated that Titles 4 and 6 protected students from discrimination based on race in connection with all programs and activities at schools. And that includes programs and activities that a school administers to maintain school safety and student discipline. Therefore, the guidance stated that the administration of discipline could really result in unlawful discrimination in one of two ways. So either a student could be subjected to different treatment based on their race, which is called disparate treatment, or the second way occurs if a policy is neutral on its face and it's administered even-handedly, but has a disparate impact. So meaning it has a disproportionate and unjustified effect on students of a particular race through the administration of the policy. So the guidance also recommended several strategies for how schools could address disparities in student discipline. And some of the key points that they address include a lot of the things that we've either talked about today, that Jerry and Ellen have really implemented in their schools and districts, and some I think that we're going to touch on later during our webinar. But some of those key points are, creating a safe, inclusive, and positive school climate that provides students with support, such as those evidence-based tiered supports and social emotional learning, training and professional development for school personnel, appropriate use of law enforcement, establishing clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences through the use of non-discriminatory and age-appropriate discipline policies, effectively communicating and engaging with that school community, emphasizing positive interventions over student removals. And then the guidance also recommended consistent monitoring and self-evaluation of penalties and outcomes and collecting data to continually evaluate and make improvements to your school discipline policies. So again, looking forward, that was rescinded, but looking forward again, I think it's fair to anticipate that the Biden administration is going to issue guidance if they do, and it will be more in line with the Obama era guidance. So far, we have yet to see anything really official on that front. What I will say is that the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, did recently issue a request for information that asks members of the public to submit comments regarding the administration of school discipline in K through 12 schools. So OCR really said that the purpose of that request was to inform determinations regarding policy guidance, technical assistance, and other resources for K-12 schools to improve school climate, safety, and ensure equal access to educational programs and activities. So the impetus for this request, Amy touched on it earlier, but is really from OCR's collection of data through their civil rights data collection that again highlighted those racial disparities in student discipline. And I will just add that it also included disparities based on disability. I know we had a comment in our comment section about that, but they did see those similar disparities in students with disabilities, and there were intersections of race and disability when they were looking at that data and the disproportionality. So, you know, for example, I know Amy gave us a couple of statistics, but I'll just add another one. In 2017 and 2018, Black students made up 15% of overall student enrollment, but represented 38% of students who received one or more out of school suspensions. That's over 2 times their share of overall student enrollment. Black students also accounted for 36% of all expulsions, again, just with that 15% of overall student enrollment. In comparison, their white students accounted for 47% of overall student enrollment, but received comparatively fewer expulsions at 36%. So really based on that data, OCR has asked for input from the community regarding ongoing discipline challenges in K-12 schools, you know, particularly, and it was mentioned earlier, but particularly as they relate to school closures, virtual learning, reopening schools, and practices for addressing student discipline and creating positive school climates as they relate to these unique learning environments that we're currently in. So those topics really may be a window into the type of guidance that we might see from OCR under the Biden administration. So we're going to be keeping an eye out for any of those developments, and we'll keep you updated as we know more. And just briefly at the state level, ISB has gathered a bunch of resources on its website. To address student discipline, restorative justice. So things like the Transforming School Discipline Collaboratives, self-assessment checklist, and model code of conduct is on there. Different restorative justice techniques and toolkits, and then resources on culturally sensitive and responsive teaching that schools and districts may want to use and refer to.
Great, thank you, Emily. You know, Ellen and Jerry, you know, for those listening who are thinking about, you know, our MTSS tiers, you know, let's talk a little bit about how the restorative justice practices and SEL initiatives that we've been discussing, you know, fit into your tiers. So if we're thinking about discipline as teaching appropriate behavior as opposed to punishing inappropriate behavior, it seems like it does fit in well with those tiered intervention systems that schools use for academics. So do you think that that is a helpful framework here? Jerry, we can start with you.
Absolutely. I think it's very helpful. If you think about your tier 1 being that universal tier, everyone gets to benefit from relationship building, from paying attention to social emotional learning, from creating and building a positive culture, from norms. Those are things that everyone can benefit from at the tier 1 before behaviors even begin to manifest themselves at all. And then you have, you know, you have 2 other tiers. When we think about those behaviors that at the next tier, where they're minor behaviors, you know, that they're not the big disruptive behaviors that you might suspend for, but those behaviors that could use some restorative conversations. And then there's actually where you're more at the 3rd tier, where there are those situations where students might otherwise have been suspended or expelled for, and what kinds of circles and what kinds of mediations you do when behavior is at that level.
So if I could jump in, I absolutely think it's helpful to frame sort of what we're talking about here in a tiered approach. And I think from a staff perspective, administrative perspective too, to the degree that you can have these conversations similarly to the way that we have academic conversations. So we teach, we have curriculum in reading or in math, and then we have assessments, and then we have data from those assessments, and we look at the data to see what it is, where we need to focus on gaps or skills that kids are missing in the area of math or reading. Similarly, we should have a similar approach, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, with social emotional learning, restorative practices, in terms of what we're talking about. And as Jerry mentioned, some things at the tier 1 level. In an elementary district, we have positive behavior interventions and supports. We teach norms, expectations, routines. We revisit those. We have morning circles or morning meetings. And then the curriculum that we have in place across our district is second step. We use a systematic approach to teach these things and then measure and assess those gaps that students have in terms of what they're not doing so well or what we need to focus on. So to the degree that I think we can have those conversations with principals who are then supporting staff with implementation of these things, but collecting data along the way and then using data to inform what we need to refine is helpful. On to the tier 2 and tier 3 piece. Tier 2, maybe there's small groups of instruction around a particular SEL skill that could benefit a group of students based on the data we've collected. Problem solving circles based on some of the behaviors that we're seeing. And an example at the tier 3 level is more of that intensive individual support and direct instruction of teaching skills. There was a question I just want to answer related to, and I think it was a comment I made. So if a student's removed from a classroom and goes to another room, is that a suspension? Well, here's sort of the way we frame this. If a student goes to a tier 3 intervention class period during the course of a day during intervention time for math or reading, that's not considered, I mean, academics, we obviously don't talk suspension wise. So it's sort of the way we frame it. And that's how I talk about it with our, if a student needs something more intensive, oftentimes there's other students too that need a similar type of support, but that's their intervention. It's a student services support interventionist. It's an interventionist that's skilled in teaching some of the skills that this particular child or children are needing to improve on. So I just wanted to address that question.
And Ellen, to what you said about being in the classroom, sometimes being out in an environment for a few minutes is a strategy. I have visited some schools that are using a number of different and more innovative practices. In this one school that I went to, they had a room that was just their calming room. Mm-hmm. It was a room that was just a nice, calm color. There was a couch. I think there was even a fish tank in the room. And it was really a space for a student who's filled with all of these emotions and that they're upset. They just need to calm down so they can have the conversation and then re-engage. So, so I think it's okay sometimes to be out of a situation if it's going to have the impact of allowing you to come back and be more productive, and it's temporary. You're not removed. It's not the same as being suspended or expelled.
Jerry, we have similar rooms that accommodate our preschool students and our elementary students as well. And I think your point is key. It's not a long-term solution. It's a temporary support that is helping a child get to the place where they can access learning again. So.
Well, so maybe on that note, when we're talking about restorative justice approaches and Senate Bill 100 and what those legal requirements are for especially out of school suspensions or expulsions in the state of Illinois. Emily, can you talk us through how restorative justice approaches interact or align with our current legal requirements in Illinois for student discipline?
Yeah, so we all recall SB 100 passing several years ago, throwing everybody a little bit into a panic. But the intent really was to reduce exclusionary discipline practices in schools and make this move towards alternative or more restorative justice approaches. I will say, if you look at the actual language of the bill or the statute, it doesn't necessarily require restorative justice approaches. So just as a super quick refresher, under SB 100, school districts and charter schools are required to show that certain criteria has been met prior to using out-of-school suspensions for a student, or prior to expelling a student or placing them at an alternative setting. So 1 to 3 day suspensions require that schools make a determination as to whether the student poses a continuing threat. And they also have to take reasonable steps to minimize the exclusion from the school environment. For 4 day suspensions, those same requirements, that continuing threat determination, steps to minimize exclusion are still required. And a school or district or charter school has to also exhaust all appropriate and available behavioral and disciplinary interventions. Then when we talk about 5 to 10 day suspensions and expulsions, they require everything that a 4 day suspension requires, plus they require the provision of appropriate and available support services. I will note too that all suspensions also require the provision of makeup work and the creation of a return to school plan. But really in terms of SB 100's relation to restorative justice approaches, that language that says, appropriate and available disciplinary interventions is really required for suspensions of 4 or more days, and expulsions is really intended to have schools consider whether there are other disciplinary interventions that really may be appropriate to use before moving forward with an exclusionary discipline plan. So again, the law doesn't explicitly require that restorative justice approaches specifically are required, but they are one option in the spectrum of alternative interventions.
Great. And I'll say that when it comes to thinking about, is something, an in-school suspension that doesn't require the application of these Senate Bill 100 factors that Emily just talked through versus an out-of-school suspension, that does. If there's questions around that, oftentimes some of the questions that we'll be talking through administrators with are, well, what is that? If there's a concern that your in-school suspension program might be viewed as something that might be exclusionary, we'll talk through things like, what does the day look like for those students? How much instruction are they able to access? How much access to certified staff do they have as part of that in-school suspension time? And so those are factors that if there is questions through to talk through with legal counsel so that you can, be sure of where those fall and when Senate Bill 100 or our, 10 days of being out of, the classroom environment, when those might kick in, those are things that can be helpful to talk through legal counsel with about, depending on what your programs look like.
Great. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about, Jerry and Ellen, if you've encountered stumbling blocks or pushback when you're moving to these more restorative practices. We've got a question here about critical race theory, and just generally in society, there's a lot of talk and conflict about race and how it is approached in schools, and what should schools teach kids about race and racial conflict. And I don't know if you guys have had to deal with any of that in your district as far as either critical race theory or just moving to more culturally responsive practices more generally. Is that a conflict that you guys have dealt with?
I will start by saying changing education is hard. And I think sometimes people have the approach that they want students to receive the same kinds of consequences that they feel that students received in their day, right? So that's the first thing, and maybe not always recognizing that some of the needs that students have and even our society and the things that we do today are different. So, and that kind of brings me to this whole idea of critical race theory. We can kind of set this over on the side for a second, and we can just look at what's happened over the last year with all the Black Lives Matter movement, with everything that people have seen so publicly when it comes to lives being taken, or people losing their lives. that has an impact, and everybody has their own response to it. But we're in school, we have to deal with students and how they're feeling and how they're responding to what's happening in the world around them, whether whoever has what theory, whoever believes in what I have are the real students in front of me who are seeing and experiencing things that I have to support them in coming back into the school environment, and that not being something that's in the way of learning. If you just think about, as it Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you want to talk about feeling safe and feeling, it's a basic fundamental need that students have to feel safe in the environment that they're in. So I haven't had to really deal with a lot of, no one's really brought up critical race theory as the pushback. It would more so be doing the things the way we've always done them. It would more so be those things, those restorative practices aren't going to work. I mean, who cares if someone says they're sorry? It's that, and it's usually just in the beginning, really, because once people really get engaged and start to build those relationships and see how things work and see how students respond when they receive the kind of support that they need, they're more likely to buy it.
I think the piece I would just add is that, in my experience, especially in the last year, one of the things that I think we just have to acknowledge and be comfortable with and get comfortable with is that if race comes up as a conversation, we have to have it. And so whether that's from a parent, whether that's from a staff member, from a student, and not everyone's comfortable with that. And so we have to figure out how to support in our roles. We have to figure out how to support those in leadership roles, those who are working with students and are working with families, and having hard but honest conversations around this topic.
And I think sometimes, to Ellen's point, I think sometimes people just don't know how to have the conversation. And the biggest thing is to be able to listen and to make space for student voices and for staff voices, because staff are impacted by the things that happen too. How do you make space for voices and for people to be heard and acknowledged for how they feel? That has a lot to do with helping people to feel valued, right? It's not always as complex as having all the answers. If all of us had all of the answers, then we wouldn't even need to have the conversation. So it's having staff and having students, having administrators comfortable with having what Ellen so appropriately described as conversations that are not always comfortable to have, but they're necessary conversations if we're all going to live and work in this world together.
Thanks, that's really helpful to hear. So, I mean, let me skip to one more topic before we conclude here at 1 and talk about school resource officers. I know that is a concern of a lot of people, and we, cited some statistics where, students of color are referred to law enforcement more frequently. That can have really negative effects. How do you guys use school resource officers? Have you had a positive experience or, recommendations for how you can make that relationship work?
Certainly, I can start. So here in District 62, we have partnered with the Des Plaines Police Department for years in a school resource officer program, and we actually have defined collaboratively the role of the school resource officer. We've done that together, and really the role of that officer, who serves all 12 buildings here in the district, is really from the standpoint of educating students, mentoring students, informal counseling, supporting staff as we are addressing issues, helping to facilitate conflict resolution or some of those restorative practices, serving as a liaison to community resources, and partnering with us when we're investigating behavior that could potentially be criminal. One thing I will say that we have done successfully, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jerry, is not, we really try to distinguish or not distinguish between police and school. So really trying to have our SRO be a staff member. Yes, they have a different role as it relates to that piece of serving as an officer, but really trying to have them embrace the educator part of their role, so that students can see them, families can often see that officer in a different way than they probably have experienced police officers previously. So it's a more positive, supportive experience.
And I would agree that it should be a more positive, supportive experience, because I think it looks a little bit different at the high school level. I think there definitely has to be a distinction between discipline and safety. So when I think about safety, I think about the role of officers in school. I think about, when you think about an intruder, when you think about weapons, when you think about school shootings, those are safety issues, right? Those are safety issues. But when you talk about a student being disruptive, when you're talking about a student being under the influence, though there are things that the school should handle as discipline, and there should be agreements between when police are invited in to participate. And what I have is, as opposed to SRO, I have off-duty police officers that work in my building. And there really needs to be that distinction between what they do to keep us safe and what we do as administrators and deans to have students on the discipline side of things. When those things get mixed up, that's when things go awry in school and school environments. And one of the things that we have to realize, especially when you're talking about students of color and you're talking about students of color outside in the community, in all communities, those interactions between students of color and police are not always positive. And there has to be an understanding that we want to have positive relationships in the school environment. We want students to be able to feel like if they're in an unsafe situation or if something's about to happen, that student can have enough confidence in that officer to be able to talk and say, hey, you need to be aware of this, this might happen, or you need to be aware of this for whatever other reason that awareness needs to be there. So everybody is not an SRO. Every police officer is not an SRO. And every police officer is not someone who enjoys working around young people in schools. And so it's important that you have people who want to have those positive relationships and work around young people and help them learn about, about the law, help them learn about keeping themselves safe, help them feel like they belong and they're a part of that community, they're not being criminalized within their school. So it really takes an important relationship. I like what Ellen said about having actually a written out agreement about these are the roles, but definitely that relationship to be well defined from the onset so that you make sure that it ends up being positive within the school.
And we're aware of a lot of districts and schools that are moving away from having SROs in their school communities. And as a firm, we often review MOUs and intergovernmental agreements for districts who are still using SROs. And we're looking at those MOUs and intergovernmental agreements that you both are talking about, that really govern the district's arrangement with the local law enforcement agency to have a school resource officer assigned to their schools. And these agreements can include those responsibilities of the SRO and expectations and training requirements for the SROs. And we often recommend that they do so that these MOUs and agreements can really be used as an opportunity to set clear expectations for what school districts expect of the SRO assigned to their schools and can have the appropriate accountability measures in place as well. So with that, I see that we're really at our time, but maybe to close, Jerry and Ellen, if you can briefly just talk through maybe some final, tips, takeaways, or practical steps that, from your experience and perspectives that schools can take now to begin addressing inequity in student discipline. Ellen, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess I would summarize, I wrap this up with, I think
Well, I always start with, I don't believe there are any throwaway children, right? You just don't put them aside and say, no, I'm done with you. We're not going to deal with you. You just go away, because that's not what happens in real life. I think it's very important that we take the time, as Ellen said, to invest in building those relationships and helping students understand how to mediate conflict. And wouldn't the world be a better place if everybody knew how to mediate conflict in a more productive manner and have people come out on the other side getting along and understanding each other better? Schools are places where students are supposed to learn, and we're preparing them for the world that they're going to be entering. What better way to do that than to pay attention to restorative practices, to pay attention to where they are socially, emotionally, to be sure that we're responding and have resources for their trauma. We're helping to shape them for life. And so I think that it's very important that we stay committed and stay the course and do it.
All right, thank you for those closing thoughts. And we're so grateful to Dr. Anderson and Dr. Swanson for sharing your experiences and insights with us. If listeners have questions or want to discuss how to tackle this work as an administrator and in your own district, you can reach out to them to continue the discussion. If you have legal questions, please do reach out to any of our attorneys at Franzik. We know this is an ongoing process. We do want you to reach out and let us know if you have questions or other topics that you think we should address. We're also interested to know if your district is doing really good work on any of these issues. So please do share this session with your colleagues. The recording will be on our Franzik website as well as our Education Law Insights podcast. And do join us again August 12th for our next equity webinar. And thank you all for being part of this effort and the work that you're doing to educate all students.
Thank you.
Thank you.